Okay, today we're going to be reading in Chapter 4 of Lord of the Flies. Remember, our aim is how do people learn the difference between right and wrong? We talked about a few different possibilities, one being that people are born good and they learn to be bad through bad influence. Another possibility is that they're born bad and they learn to be good through good influence, or that they're born neutral and learn to be good or bad depending on the influence. So in this chapter, in this scene, we're really asking, according to William Golding, the author, based on this scene, how do people learn the difference between right and wrong? A few vocabulary words that we're going to encounter in the scene. Chastisement means a reprimand or a punishment, and it's a noun. Impalpable means not tangible, not touchable. And you can see it has that able at the end of it, which tells us that it's an adjective. Myriad means a variety. It's a noun. There are a couple of words in the scene that you just need to know so you can understand what's happening. To whimper means to cry. Transparencies, you'll see this little boy is very interested in the transparencies. You see the word transparent is in it. So they mean little see-through creatures that you find in the sand. You may have seen these yourself on the beach sometime. It also says the word hams, which just means his legs. So let's look at Chapter 4, pages 59 to 62. Follow along in your own book as I read. On the bottom of page 59. We're talking here about the little children, right? The little ones, as it's called in the book. They had built castles in the sand at the bar of the little river. These castles were about 1 foot high and were decorated with shells, withered flowers, and interesting stones. Round the castles was a complex of marks, tracks, walls, railway lines that were of significance only if inspected with the eye at beach level. The little ones played here, if not happily, at least with absorbed attention. And often as many as 3 of them would come and play the same game together. 3 were playing here now. Henry was the biggest of them. He was also a distant relative of that other boy whose mulberry-marked face had not been seen since the evening of the great fire. Remember that boy with the mulberry patch on his face? Well, he hasn't been seen since. But he was not old enough to understand this, and if he, Henry, had been told the other boy had gone home on an aircraft, he would have accepted the statement without fuss or disbelief, which tells us about how old he is. Henry was a bit of a leader this afternoon, because the other 2 were Percival and Johnny, the smallest boys on the island. Percival was mouse-colored and had not been very attractive even to his mother. Johnny was well-built with fair hair and natural belligerence. Just now he was being obedient because he was interested, and the 3 children kneeling in the sand were at peace. Roger and Maurice, 2 members of the hunters, the choir, the older kids, Roger and Maurice came out of the forest. They were relieved from duty at the fire and had come down for a swim. Roger led the way straight through the castles, kicking them over, burying the flowers, scattering the chosen stones. Maurice followed, laughing, and added to the destruction. The 3 little ones paused in their game and looked up. As it happened, the particular marks in which they were interested had not been touched, so they made no protest. Only Percival began to whimper with an eye full of sand, and Maurice hurried away. In his other life, Maurice had received chastisement for filling a younger eye with sand. Now, though there was no parent to let fall a heavy hand, Maurice still felt the unease of wrongdoing. At the back of his mind formed the uncertain outlines of an excuse. He muttered something about a swim and broke into a trot. Roger remained, watching the little ones. He was not noticeably darker than when he had dropped in, but the shock of black hair down his nape and low on his forehead seemed to suit his gloomy face, and made what had seemed at first an unsociable remoteness into something forbidding. Percival finished his whimper and went on playing, for the tears had washed the sand away. Johnny watched him with china blue eyes, then began to fling up sand in a shower, and presently Percival was crying again. When Henry tired of his play and wandered off along the beach, Roger followed him, keeping beneath the palms and drifting casually in the same direction. So Roger is following Henry down the beach. Henry walked at a distance from the palms and the shade because he was too young to keep himself out of the sun. He went down to the beach and busied himself at the water's edge. The great Pacific tide was coming in, and every few seconds the relative still water of the lagoon heaved forward an inch. There were creatures that lived in this last fling of the sea, tiny transparencies that came questing in with the water over the hot, dry sands. With impalpable organs of sense, they examined this new field. Perhaps food had appeared where in the last incursion there had been none. Bird droppings, insects perhaps, any of the strewn detritus of landward life. Like a myriad of tiny teeth in a saw, the transparencies came scavenging over the beach. This was fascinating to Henry. He poked about with a bit of a stick, that itself was wave-warm and whitened and a vagrant, and tried to control the motions of the scavengers. He made little runnels as the tide filled, and tried to crowd them with creatures. He became absorbed beyond mere happiness as he felt himself exercising control over other living things. He talked to them, urging them, ordering them. Driven back by the tide, his footprints became bays in which they were trapped, and gave him the illusion of mastery. He squatted on his hands at the water's edge, bowed with a shock of hair falling over his forehead and past his eyes, and the afternoon sun emptied down invisible arrows. So let's see what Roger does when he's watching Henry play with these little insects that he's found on the beach. Roger waited too. At first he had hidden behind a great palm, but Henry's absorption with the transparencies was so obvious that at last he stood out in full view. He looked along the beach. Percival had gone off crying, and Johnny was left in triumphant possession of the castle. He sat there crooning to himself and throwing sand at an imaginary Percival. Beyond him, Roger could see the platform and the glints of spray where Ralph and Simon and Piggy and Maurice were diving in the pool. He listened carefully, but could only just hear them. A sudden breeze shook the fringe of palm trees so that the fronds tossed and fluttered. 60 feet above Roger, several nuts, fibrous lumps as big as rugby balls, coconuts, were loosed from their stems. They fell about him with a series of hard thumps. Bump, bump, bump. And he was not touched. Roger did not consider his escape, but looked from the nuts to Henry and back again. What's Roger thinking? The subsoil beneath the palm trees was a raised beach, and generations of palms had worked loose in this the stones that had laid on the sand of another shore. Roger stooped, picked up a stone, aimed, and threw it at Henry. Threw it to miss. The stone, that token of preposterous time, bounced 5 yards to Henry's right and fell in the water. Roger gathered a handful of stones and began to throw them. Yet there was a space around Henry, perhaps 6 yards in diameter, into which he dare not throw. Here, invisible yet strong, was the taboo of the old life. Round the squatting child was the protection of parents and school and policemen and the laws. Roger's arm was conditioned by a civilization that knew nothing of him and was in ruin. So that's our scene. Now let's try and think about how that scene helps us understand William Golding's opinion about how these boys know the difference between right or wrong, how anyone knows the difference between right and wrong. Think about these questions and try and answer them. They'll help us get to the bottom of this aim. The first one is, why does Maurice mutter something about a swim and run off when Percival was whimpering? You can go back into your own book and look at that part and see, why does he do that? And the second one is, why doesn't Roger throw the stones closer to where Henry was playing? You could answer these questions on the Google Doc that was sent to you on the Barkai website. It was also emailed to your parents. So think about those two questions, answer them in the Google Doc, and we'll try and figure out the answer to the aim tomorrow in class.